Here's the location of the Franks in 400 AD, the Silurian Franks to be exact, because there were several Frankish tribes that were not yet unified. Their location is an educated guess. Among the non-Roman peoples, they were what the Romans called the Frisia, located on the lower Rhine River in what is today the Netherlands. The Frisia were pirates. Historians think that they may be the same people who, in the 3rd century AD, are mentioned in Roman annals as the Silurian Franks. One commonality among the Germanic tribes, the barbarians as they were called, is that they were migratory. This map shows the movement of the Silurian Franks, rendered here in German as Silesia Franken, from the lower Rhine River area to the Scheldt River estuary area between 400 and 440 AD. That was a modest migration, as was the case with other Germanic tribes. But an invasion of Europe by the Huns, a people from Central Asia, led to a major migration as some Germanic tribes, notably the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, fled the Huns. The Ostrogoths were overrun by the Huns and enslaved. The Visigoths asked the Romans to enter the empire for protection and received it. The Roman emperor thought that they would assist him in warding off the Huns. But the Romans didn't know how to handle a refugee population. The Visigoths suffered considerable hardship, concluded that the Romans had betrayed them, and rebelled, resulting in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, which we discussed earlier in the presentation. As the Roman Empire grew weaker, other tribes took advantage of that weakness to migrate into the empire itself. Among the tribes that took part in this wave of migration were the Silurian Franks. They didn't necessarily seek to destroy the empire. They widely admired these Germanic tribes and sought to achieve the better life that it promised. But the Western Empire fell. The Eastern Empire lasted another 10 centuries, be it remembered, and the larger Germanic tribes coalesced into kingdoms. This map shows the boundaries of those kingdoms in the early 6th century. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the larger Germanic tribes coalesced into these kingdoms. And Germanic and Roman people now lived alongside one another. And this map shows the boundaries of these kingdoms in the early 6th century. In each kingdom, the same basic drama occurred. Western Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, was characterized by, first, deurbanization. As economic activity contracted and city dwellers could no longer depend on receiving enough food from the countryside, and so they left the cities to become farmers themselves. It was characterized by the dominance of Germanic leadership and decentralization and the adoption of the political culture of the Germanic kingdoms. These emphasized the personal strength of leaders. Kings were often elected by the nobles rather than inheriting their thrones. Weak leaders had less legitimacy and less ability to retain the obedience of their vassals, those who were their subordinates. Third, Roman Catholic bishops became powerful as another source of authority. For a time after the empire fell, many Gallo-Romans, that is to say, Romans living in Gaul or present-day France, had no other source of authority. Bishops assumed the roles traditionally played by aristocratic magistrates. They dispensed influence and political patronage. They mediated disputes. They owned considerable land and used the income it generated to fund charities and the construction of public buildings. In short, they became a new wealthy elite who assumed the old aristocracy's role in the care and nurturing of the citizenry. Next, military service became localized. Theoretically, all men owed service to the king, but in practice, they followed a local leader who in turn owed service to a more powerful leader, up to the most powerful leaders who personally owed service to the king. Now, to return to the picture of Clovis in the Gallery of Battles at Versailles, it depicts him at the moment when he is pleading for help from the Christian God during the Battle of Tolbiac against the Alemanni in 496 AD. Clovis at that time was still pagan, but his wife was Catholic. And so he was familiar with Christianity. And so it's not surprising then in that moment he would appeal to the Christian God for help. Clovis went on to win the battle, and Clovis soon converted to Christianity, specifically to Roman Catholicism. And then Clovis went on to unify the other branches of the Franks, thereby establishing the Frankish kingdom. He also founded what became known as the Merovingian dynasty, which was named for his grandfather, Merovech. The Merovingian kings, these Merovingian kings, ruled the Frankish kingdom for the next 2 centuries. This map shows the Merovingian kingdom as it was a century after Clovis's death in 511 AD. The Franks had come a long way since their origins in the lower Rhine River Valley. That's in the very northern part of the orange area that you're looking at now. The kingdom originated in a region called Austrasia. It was this region that Clovis had defended in the Battle of Tolbiac. But the French steadily expanded the kingdom, shoving the Visigoths into Spain, as I mentioned earlier, and pushing all the way to the Mediterranean, where they occupied present-day Provence. This expansion could not have occurred without military power. So what was the Merovingian military like? What was the military of the Frankish kingdom like? Well, because hard currency was in short supply, land was the primary reward for service. Victor Davis Hanson emphasizes this in his chapter on the landed infantry in the Battle of Poitiers, together, of course, with his emphasis on the continued importance of infantry. Every free household was to provide a warrior for the army. Frankish infantry used a variety of weapons and often carried several at once. This man in the picture has a javelin, a dagger, and a sword. Historians question which military influence upon the Merovingian army was strongest, the Roman tradition or the Frankish tradition. In terms of weaponry, it was obviously the Frankish tradition. But in terms of tactics, Victor Davis Hanson, following the major historian of the Merovingian military, a guy named Bernard Bachrach, thinks that it was the Romans. What about cavalry? A landed warrior could also be a cavalryman. But in his chapter on the Battle of Poitiers, Hanson works hard to suggest that Merovingian heavy cavalry was not important. This runs counter to the views of other historians. Hanson relies on the work of Bachrach, that specialist on the Merovingian military that I mentioned a moment ago. Bachrach's scholarship, however, is respected, but not always convincing. And I think Hanson turns toward Bachrach's scholarship primarily because it tells Hanson what he wants to hear. He wants to hear that infantry is more important than cavalry. Bachrach tells him that. It fits Hanson's thesis the best, and so Hanson goes with that. I would say, by the way, that the chapter on Poitiers in Carnage and Culture is by far the least convincing of Hanson's various case studies. Now let's leap forward another century to this man, Charles Martel. Charles Martel was a Frankish statesman and military leader who, as Duke and Prince of the Franks and mayor of the palace, the man, which was not a mayor in the sense we have mayors of cities today, but rather the manager of the household of the Frankish king, very roughly the equivalent of a present day prime minister. So he's a very powerful man. Not yet a king, but really one step removed, sort of the power behind the throne. And by this time, the Merovingian kings had become increasingly soft. The Merovingian kings were reduced to a primarily ceremonial role, and Charles Martel became the de facto ruler of the Frankish kingdom from 718 AD, when he was just 30 years old, until his death in 741 AD. Now, Charles Martel is important to us for two reasons. First, he defeated the Muslims in the Battle of Poitiers in 732 AD. And second, he founded the Carolingian dynasty, which we'll see later on became of extraordinary importance in Western and Central Europe.